Historians have often emphasized the irony that it was none other than socialist governments who turned labor into an object or even commodity to be sold for money. In her book about Hungarian collectivization, the sociologist Martha Lemplund argues that, quote, the process of commodifying labor has been fully realized under socialism, end of quote. Categories or emphases might differ. It might be commodified labor, or as Andrew stresses in this panel, alienated labor. Yet there is a shared understanding that socialism was verging on capitalism in disguise. Indeed, in the history of socialism, there are many moments in which its explicit goal was the linking of work, money, and, as Lemplund would emphasize, time. The entire reform decade of the Soviet 1960s is a case in point. This decade saw fundamental monetary wage reforms, both in industry and agriculture. Yet, these wage reforms, which were designed to incentivize workers to work more efficiently by linking their performance to monetary remuneration, encountered serious obstacles from the start. Most importantly, money possessed only limited power for consumption in the Soviet command economy, which is why monetary incentives only went so far. This is where another strand of research enters the debate. Rather than looking primarily at the limited power of money in Soviet-style economies, this research takes the monetary incentives as a matter of fact. It assumes that money in socialism had essentially the same qualities as in capitalism. Accordingly, the conclusion this research draws is that the Soviets simply did not pay enough. Effort or achievement, that is the level of individual productivity, was not remunerated appropriately. This then serves as a commonly cited factor for the Soviet Union's demise. In other words, for some scholars, socialism failed because it effectively introduced wage labor and thus capitalist exploitation, whereas others would claim socialism failed because it was not capitalist enough. Such a narrative of failure, however, does not explain the cohesion of the Soviet system, which, after all, lasted for almost 75 years. 75 turbulent years, to be sure. In my project, I will argue that one of the reasons for the cohesion of Soviet society, particularly after the so-called de-Stalinization, was the role work played for Soviet citizens, particularly in the 60s and 70s, and how their work involved them in the Soviet project. I will argue that it was work which made people essentially feel Soviet. Work's identity-creating capacities allow for an explanation of the Soviet project's durability and nostalgic afterlife. In much of the historiography, work is often stressed as crucial, only to be then sidelined as merely one element of Soviet ideology that did not necessarily relate to what was happening on the ground. In fact, one of the standard narratives in Soviet history is that nobody worked anyway. The history of work is therefore often told as a history of shirking, waiting, being industrious one week, and doing nothing for the following 3. One of my claims is that people living in the Soviet Union worked a lot, not necessarily during official designated working hours, but in what would usually be called free time. Here we may think of the dacha and the many DIY repairs, or of course care work, the questionable privilege for Soviet women of all generations. Many goods and services were produced in so-called free time, with no money ever changing hands. In other words, people in the Soviet Union worked for a lot more reasons than for money only. Something therefore seems to be missing if the sphere of work is relegated to questions of too much or too little commodification. For this reason, I would like to give much greater attention to figuring out what work meant for Soviet citizens by looking at the activity itself. My goal is to write a cultural and, yes, emotional history of work in the late Soviet Union by asking, what was work in the late Soviet Union? Where, when, and why was it done? What role did wages play? And most importantly, how did work generate meaning and a sense of belonging for Soviet citizens? Today, when people over 60 years of age remember the Soviet Union, they often explicitly juxtapose the Soviet and post-Soviet years in monetary terms. One of my interviewees expressed the opinion that in the post-Soviet period, quote, people only work for money. Work is only done for the money. Whereas during the Soviet period, people would work for the usefulness or the benefit of society. Of course, he went on, usefulness for society was not the main reason, but, quote, we like that we did something useful. Нравилось, что полезное дело делаем. His nostalgia about having a shared purpose in work is more complex than a simple misrepresentation of the past. It was the diary of Nikolai Kazakov that helped me realize the extent to which this notion of feeling useful is central to explaining what it meant for people in the Soviet Union to work and how working was crucial for being Soviet. For the remaining 15 to 18 minutes, I would like to do a close reading of some of the passages of Kazakov's diary. I'm aware of the huge discussion about diary writing in the Soviet Union, which, however, in this paper will only be a kind of backdrop. Let me introduce to you Nikolai Kazakov. In May 1962, Nikolai turned 31. He was born in Leningrad and evacuated with his mother to the Gorky region during World War II. He went to Moscow State University to study history in the 1950s, though it's unclear exactly when and if he graduated. Due to a stutter, he never ended up working as a history teacher. In 1962, Nikolai was working as a lorry driver at a construction enterprise in Rabotok, a town located about 50 kilometers southeast of Gorky, today's Nizhny Novgorod, at the Volga. When his first marriage went sour in late 1961, after only a couple of months, he moved back in with his mother in the nearby village of Katnitse, which is here on the Volga. His mother worked as an accountant in the local children's home, where she lived in what seems to have been a one-room apartment with a small kitchen and an outhouse. Nikolai was not only a diligent diary writer, but an obsessive one. He started keeping diary in 1947 when he was 15 years old and stopped at some point in the 1960s. During these 15 or so years, Kazakov filled over 100 notebooks. Almost every day he spent up to 2 or 3 hours composing several pages, usually in the evenings. His favorite place to write was his so-called cabinet. This was actually the office at the children's home where his mother worked during the day. His diary for 1962 consisted of 10 notebooks. Nikolai Kazakov was by no means an exemplary Soviet worker. In fact, in 1962, he only officially worked for the first half of the year. From January to June, he worked as a lorry driver, the first 3 months in the Gorky region, and from April to June in North Kazakhstan. During his stint in Kazakhstan, he did not keep his diary. At the end of June, he left Kazakhstan for the Ukrainian city Kharkov to be treated for his stutter Interestingly, he was treated with hypnosis. In August, he spent about 2 weeks with relatives at their dacha outside of Moscow, after which he traveled back to Kadnitse and tried to find work for the rest of the year throughout this region, to no avail. The diary of 1962 might seem an unlikely source for a historical study of work in the Soviet Union. First of all, doing microhistory is still quite unpopular when it comes to the larger question of economy, which are usually situated at macro levels. Secondly, Nikolai Kazakov was out of work for at least half of the year. In fact, he could have easily been prosecuted as a so-called Tuniadets parasite for not working. In May 1961, the Soviet Union introduced a law which allowed for prosecuting people who did not carry out socially useful work and could sentence them up to 5 years imprisonment and exile. In many other respects too, Nikolai's morality was not quite the exemplary Soviet one. He drank too much, too regularly. He fell in and out of love and enjoyed a couple of affairs throughout 1962. He had a daughter from his failed marriage, but did not care about her at all. He strongly disliked Khrushchev, whom he described as filthy, and he missed Stalin's hard and unforgiving regime. Not much is known about Nikolai's life after 1962. After his death in 2005, his diaries and his photographs ended up with an artist who in 2016 published Nikolai's diary entries from 1962. The published version has 606 pages. For the first 3 months of 1962, Nikolai's diary entries typically start like this. I got up at 7 o'clock. The weather was tolerable. It was minus 16 degrees. At 8 o'clock after breakfast, I went to Kolka's car. He had already started the blowtorch and warmed the engine case, but the blowtorch did not burn well. Once we fixed the blowtorch, we warmed up the exhaust manifold. The motor started running just fine, and about 8:30, we were on our way. In the following few pages, Nikolai described his and Kolka's workday. A planned trip to Gorky to fetch their boss did not happen because there was no fuel. They got stuck in snow several times and one of their tires went flat. So they decided to drive to the garage in Sabrudnoye instead, where Nikolai's car, a Gas 63, was parked in the Enterprise's garage. Some of the lights had been stolen from his gas after only one night in the garage. They changed Kolka's flat tire, stole some car lights from someone else, drove back to Kadnitse, and arrived back home at 3 in the afternoon. Nikolai then sat down and busied himself sketching out how to revamp his motorbike with indicators and more lights. He entirely lost track of time until he realized at 11 o'clock that his eyes hurt from drawing, sketching, and concentrating. This day's diary ends with the following remark. I went to bed at 1 o'clock, incredibly late, but tomorrow we won't go to work. There is no fuel anyway. Nothing we could possibly do there anyway. In the absence of such essential things as fuel and lights, Nikolai was occupied hunting them down in order to be able to do his actual job at some point, which would have been driving stuff and people around. Indeed, his workday appears to have been one utter waste of time. With entries like this, it would be easy to tell the traditional story about the Soviet Union where nobody worked because there was no work to be done in the first place. How then does this diary help us to understand work in the Soviet Union? I would argue the repetitive pattern in his entries is key. For the first 3 months, every single workday, and thus every entry, followed the same pattern. His days always started with him and Kolka getting their engines running. Here's the entry from Thursday 25th, which is 25th of January, which is remarkably similar to the one already quoted. I got up at 6:30. There was a faint southwest wind, 3 degrees below zero. I washed myself, had breakfast. 5 minutes to 7, I fetched the blowtorch in order to get the engine running. Kolka was there too, had his one running already and filled up the water. I turned my blowtorch on and warmed my engine up wonderfully. Хорошенько. He then continues to describe his way to work and what he did there, which was mostly repairing things and waiting for his boss. At 6 o'clock, Nikolai arrived back home, had dinner and went to bed at 9. Apart from 10 very short sentences at the very beginning and very end, the entire entry is dedicated to his workday. Nikolai meticulously noted with whom he drove from A to B, when he switched gears, how long which journey took, how on their way they had to stop in order to quickly fix something, that he oiled a certain item over and over again, and how he eventually managed to repair it, how he waited for his boss, and who else he had a chat with that day. In other words, his workday, which on that particular day lasted 11 hours, accounted for more than 90% of his diary entry, whereas the remaining 4 waking hours around it received a mere 10 sentences. Even if nothing extraordinary happened, his everyday routine at work was jotted down day by day. His routine at home, however, was not. Put differently, his workdays were important enough to him to be written down meticulously. To be sure, there were evenings with his friends or encounters with women, which he also documented, and in no less detail. But these were out of the ordinary events and decidedly non-routine. Not only did Nikolai choose to focus on his workday in his diary, it could be argued that he effectively expanded his workday by some hours each day by writing down what happened at work. Whenever he did not manage to write an entry, perhaps because he went for a drink in the evening, he made sure to make up for the gap the very next day. Work provided Nikolai with meaning and sense in his life. Otherwise, he would not have spent so much time writing it down. He rarely documented his private life, let alone his emotions. However, February 1st was a happy day. Nikolai managed to organize some very precious spare parts for his cars. He succeeded in repairing a particular item, which of course he described in detail. Details I will spare you. Compared to other entries, this day reads like an outburst of enthusiasm. It might have been because I felt so warm from work. I did super work today. Сегодня я здорово поработал. Or because the wind slackened, but the walk home was wonderful. Nikolai was in a very good mood due to his work. He was proud of himself and his achievements. He felt warm from work. He clearly had enjoyed his workday. You might very well say now, Nikolai had one good day at work. So what? And again, my response would be repetition is key. To be sure, this was an extraordinary pleasant workday for Nikolai. But the exception of having one good workday is not the reason why this workday was jotted down in the evening. Because Nikolai documented all his workdays, the good ones, the average ones, and the bad ones. Why? Because it was work which provided his life with meaning. Quote, "Today I criminally wasted my time," end of quote. Sentences like this from July 15th appear when Nikolai no longer has an official workplace. Was Nikolai merely being ironic? In his first 3 months in Katowice, he never wrote about wasting time, even though one could argue many of his work days were exactly that, a waste of time. 4 weeks later, on August 15th, now at his relative's dacha, he wrote, quote, "Today I did nothing socially useful at all and twiddled my thumbs all day long." He explicitly used the phrase socially useful. Again, one could think that this was irony, since socially useful was a legal notion for deciding whether or not people were parasites. It was August, the holiday month in the Soviet Union, where everyone except agricultural workers was at the dacha with friends and relatives. 2 days later, Nikolai was in a very bad mood, anxious, depressed, fretting about finding a job and which job he would like to have. Wallowing in self-pity in one of his rare expressions of explicit emotion, he asked, quote, "Where should I, poor me, work and live?" On the very next day, August 18th, he wrote, "I am sick to death here. At home, I should be repairing my motorcycle and I should go to Talbu straight away and should try to get work there. I've got 3 things to do, but I'm hanging around here and waste my time for nothing." Even if he was being ironic when using the phrase socially useful, he did feel useless without work and something to occupy him. He did not quite know how to live on. He mused about his perspectives and which jobs he couldn't do due to his stammer. He had ambitions of becoming a writer, but being a writer required talent and he felt deeply insecure about his. To create something without talent is impossible. You can drive your car well or not so well. You might like it or not like it. It might be good or bad, but you will definitely transport your delivery. In other words, as a lorry driver, you did not have to think about what it was you were doing. You simply delivered the stuff that needed transporting. This did not demand any extra skills or talent. You simply did your job. Yet, it could also give you a sense of doing something useful. A feeling Nikolai missed badly after being out of official work for a mere 7 weeks. In actual fact, he had only really been out of work for 2 weeks, since he had spent 3 weeks in Kharkov for treatment and 2 weeks for traveling home from Kazakhstan, then to Kharkov and then to Moscow, where he was now languishing at the dacha in the holiday month of August and feeling deeply useless. To conclude, the meaning of work usually does not play a decisive part in economic or in labor history. Economic history in particular is often a history of grand narratives, of numbers and statistics. Practices, meanings, and emotions are mostly relegated to economic anthropology or anthropology. The history of work in the Soviet Union can only be partially explained when we look at questions of remuneration and wages. Feeling useful was a key factor in why people worked in the Soviet 1960s and 70s. It might not explain how the Soviet command economy worked or how the planners generated and failed at their numbers. Yet it does explain how socialism was lived, experienced, and practiced. This notion of palza, utility, doing useful things for oneself as well as for others, is omnipresent in ego documents like diaries, letters, or memoirs. Nikolai was not the only one who found meaning in his work, nor was he the only one who wanted to feel useful. Of course, his anxiety about the future was also about the money he would not be able to earn, but this was only one of the many aspects of how Nikolai assessed his official work and what he gained from it. His diary illuminates what many people miss about the Soviet Union and socialism in general, the sphere of work and what it gave them. Soviet history has plenty of ironies. Introducing wage labor and proletarianizing everybody is one of them. Another one is that the Soviet Union succeeded in inculcating the idea of work as a prime necessity of man. Work as prime necessity of man was something the party program of 1961 imagined as a utopian, mind you, not dystopian, future. In the neoliberal times we are currently living, this notion of work has gained new traction. The future of work might very well be a surprisingly Soviet one. Thank you.